This is a story that threads together many elements: a rapidly expanding British Empire, and England going through a moral and religious transformation, and Australia taking on the shape of the country we know today. We will follow the life of John Batman, whose story was moulded by these elements and himself grasped hold of the opportunities they presented. His vitality and will would lead him to create a new British settlement, a settlement that would rapidly become the city of Melbourne. It is a tale of great adventure that connects the histories of three Australian states, New South Wales, Tasmania, and Victoria, with the wider British imperial world. Along the way, we will meet convicts and Aboriginal warriors, bushrangers and career imperialists, fighters and peacemakers. While following Batman's life story, we will look at events involving the early settlement of Van Diemen's Land, the conflicts there with the bushrangers and the Aboriginals, the expedition to Port Phillip and its aftermath, and I will try to explain something of the environment and the world that these events took place in. John Batman was born in Parramatta, New South Wales on the 21st of January 1801. He was the son of a convict, the Englishman William Batman, who had been sentenced at 1796 to 14 years transportation to Australia for the crime of receiving stolen salt pepper and ingredients of gunpowder. At the time of his sentence, William was a family man. He had a wife, Mary Batman, and 2 children. Unlike with modern prison systems, the relations of a convict could elect to follow the convict into exile. Mary paid for herself and her 2 children to join William aboard the ship, the Ganges, from England to New South Wales in 1797. What did the Batman family find on arrival? Life could be surprisingly good for British convicts transported to New South Wales. Now, good has to be understood relatively. We're talking about exiled criminals in the 18th and 19th centuries, after all. Being exiled from home, never seeing your family again, and an often sickly and malnourishing sea journey to the ends of the earth, followed by cruel authorities and a possible flogging after arrival, I don't mean to underestimate the pain of this experience, but many convicts ultimately did do well out of their new life in Australia. Arriving convicts worked for the period of their sentence either for the government or private employers, in a role akin to indentured labourers. Rather than entering something like a prison, convicts could acquire money through part-time work, had their own free time outside of curfew, and enjoyed a diet and health beyond what many free labourers had back in England. Not everyone thrived, but a convict had a fighting chance of a good life in New South Wales. You can check out my video, Surviving Convict Life in Australia, for more details. William Batman would seem to have been among the winners of the transportation game. In many ways, he and his family probably came at exactly the right moment. Speaking very generally, the convict regime became stricter over time. In 1797, a mere 9 years after the arrival of the First Fleet, it was still within the early days when wages for convicts were good, land easily available to former convicts, and most importantly of all, tickets of leave were pretty easy to come by if you were a useful member of the colony. Tickets of leave were essentially the award of freedom to well-behaved convicts. As a convict with a ticket of leave, you couldn't depart Australia and return to England until the term of your original sentence was completed, but you could live your life independently in the colony, working for yourself. William Batman received his ticket of leave after only a few years and immediately established his own timber yard in Parramatta, a town just a short distance from Sydney. Here the Batmans would have more children, including John, our main subject, and his younger brother Henry, who will also be part of our narrative. British settlement had only begun with the founding of Sydney in 1788. Being born in Australia in 1801 makes John Batman one of the first native-born British Australians to make his mark on history. He was what would, by the 1820s, be called a currency lad, a term for native-born white Australians derived from the local money in circulation in New South Wales, which was called currency as opposed to sterling, the official British money, which was often in short supply at the time in Australia. From the earliest colonial times, literally from the first children born from the first settlers of the First Fleet, people noted how the native-born grew up remarkably healthy and strong. John Batman fit this mold, his energy remarked upon by many who met him. William Batman became an active Methodist, and he had his children educated at the Methodist mission in Parramatta. This will have huge implications for John's life, not because he showed himself to be especially influenced by Christian morality or desirous of spreading the word of God, but because it gave him access to two special resources. The first is contact and cooperation with Aboriginal people. Sydney and Parramatta at this time had a significant Aboriginal element, known as Sydney Blacks. These Aboriginals didn't necessarily live full-time in the settlement. Rather, they lived with one foot in the bush and one in the town, with part of their life engaged in their traditional hunter-gathering, and the other in Sydney, looking to acquire those remarkable British luxuries, flour, rum, and sugar. The Methodist mission took it upon itself to educate Aboriginal children, and the Sunday school had 19 of them enrolled while John was there. This familiarity with Aboriginals is going to have a marked impact on Batman's career, with Sydney Blacks working with him in all his endeavours. The second resource provided by Methodist education was exposure to the ideology of religious and moral reform that was then taking over the British world. A Protestant evangelical revival had been brewing since the mid-18th century, and the denomination, now known as Methodism, was one of its products. The evangelical movement was politically active, with big policy objectives such as the abolition of slavery. It would have a profound effect on how the English saw themselves. Victorian morality was its creation. By comparison, 18th century England was far more relaxed about sex, marriage, prostitution, and somewhat less inclined to moral outrages. This new, more moralistic, more religious England was just coming into its own in the early 19th century and would succeed in abolishing the British Empire slave trade in 1807, when Batman was a young boy. This was evangelicalism's first great political victory, but the movement soon sought out more battles with the great confidence their success had given them. Australia gave them two moral, political crusades. The fate of the transported convicts was the first, whose status was likened incorrectly to that of Caribbean slavery, and then the Aboriginals. The London armchair moral crusader didn't object to the British colonial presence in of itself, but was distressed by the failure of colonial authorities to Christianize the Aboriginals, or to protect them from the convicts, whose lowly origins made them an easy scapegoat for attacks on the natives. In fact, both their concerns involve serious misunderstandings. The convicts really were not like Caribbean slaves, and the assumption that the brutal fate of the Australian Aboriginals was the fault of the convicts is pure scapegoating of a strata of people predominantly working class with little chance of standing up for their reputation. The influx of free settlers, rather than convicts, into new territory led to conflict just the same, as will be seen in John Batman's career. Just as the experience of Aboriginals would be useful to John Batman, so would his understanding of the mental world of the British evangelical movement. By this time, the evangelical movement was reaching beyond its natural home in the middle classes and getting its grip on the souls of the ruling class. Being able to talk their language could be a powerful tool for young Batman. In these ways, providing knowledge of both Aboriginal culture and evangelical ideology, the education that William gave his son John was perfect for a future Australian imperialist. At the age of 15, John was apprenticed to a blacksmith. From what we know of his future behaviour, it seems unlikely that in any circumstance John Batman would have stayed permanently in Parramatta. He would show himself to be extremely ambitious. However, the immediate cause of his leaving home and going to make his fortune as a colonial pioneer was what his biographer James Bonwick later called a love adventure. There aren't a lot of details available, but in November 1821, the Parramatta Orphan School Committee met to discuss his responsibility in the pregnancy of a girl in their care. John Batman decided to skip town. Taking his younger brother Henry with him, they headed to a place where fortunes were being made by those with the courage to fight for them. A country of banditry, adventurers, and conflict. Van Diemen's Land. The island we now call Tasmania was once the wild, southernmost frontier of British civilization. The British settlement had begun here in 1803 and quickly developed into an especially wild colonial setting. The number of British settlers was very low until ballooning in the late 1820s. The low population and the rarity of ships bringing outside supplies or trade, combined with abundant opportunities for hunting, meant that the bush became the key source of sustenance for the British settlers. Kangaroo meat was staple fare. This required the settlers to become bushmen to an extent that wasn't necessary in Sydney, which in turn meant the authorities had no chance of keeping tabs on the convict population. A convict hunting kangaroo in the bush, armed and unattended, followed by a hunting dog or two, is about as free as any man can be, at least until he returns to town. The convict knows this, and it often occurs to him that he could just not return to town. John Batman would thrive in this environment. He had the energy, youth, and strength of body that he needed to turn himself into a successful frontiersman. He also had timing on his side. At this time in Van Diemen's Land, the number of respectable free settlers was low, with many of the non-convicts being former convicts. Thus, there was relatively little competition for land grants. In later times, it would be much harder for someone of Batman's origins to thrive. He struck out as a grazier. Sheep at this time in Australia were kept primarily for their meat rather than their wool, which was uneconomical to export. Batman did well after supplying meat to the government store in Georgetown near Launceston. The government stores in colonial Australia were the official supply intended for convicts, soldiers, and early settlers. Batman was essentially selling meat to the government, which was then redistributed to the community, enabling Batman and others like him to build fortunes at the expense of British taxpayers. Who said empire comes cheap? He did well, and in 1824 he qualified for a land grant of 600 acres at Kingston, near the mountain Ben Lomond in the northeast of the island. He was joined there by a woman, Eliza Thompson. She was an Irish convict who absconded from her work placement to live with Batman. Now, why would a man making a great success of himself, rapidly becoming a major landowner, marry a criminal runaway? Frankly, a man in Van Diemen's Land did not have many options. The white population of the colony in 1824 was 6% female, of which 2/3 were convict women. In consequence, convict women often became the wives or mistresses of the colony's most powerful people. Even the island's wealthiest and most successful landowner, Edward Lord, married a convict woman, which only compounded the lack of options for men of lower social status. The great majority of men in Van Diemen's Land could only satisfy their needs by trading British goods to the Aboriginals in exchange for sexual favours. So, Batman can't have had many options. That he had a woman at all marks him as a successful Van Diemen's Lander. Nonetheless, there are several suggestions within the historical record that Batman was sincerely attached to his wife, and she bore him 7 children. During this period, Van Diemen's Land was in the grip of a crisis. Violence ruled the bush. The ease with which convicts could survive in the bush convinced some to make it their permanent home, escaping from their convict status. They became bushrangers, the bandits and outlaws of Australian colonial legend. By the time Batman arrived, bushrangers had gone beyond merely attempting to evade authority to blatantly attacking it. Bushrangers attacked the properties of government officials, mocked the colony's leadership, robbed farms closer and closer to the centres of British population, and even started to threaten Hobart Town itself, the main centre of population and colonial authority. The colonial government responded as firmly as its legal status and limited resources would allow. An attempt at martial law was quashed as illegal by Governor Macquarie in Sydney, the mother colony, at this time New South Wales still having jurisdiction over Van Diemen's Land. The small numbers of soldiers available could pursue bushrangers only with great difficulty through the bush country, while the bushrangers themselves were often supported covertly by convict workers and sometimes made alliances of sorts with Aboriginal bands. By the time Batman arrived, the government had settled on techniques that were turning the tide against the bushrangers. A collaboration that brought together free settlers and individual soldiers working for bounty money, convicts working for a ticket of leave or even a free pardon, and cooperative Aboriginals. Many of the latter were not locals, but actually Aboriginals from New South Wales, exiled to Van Diemen's Land, providing their bush skills to the British in the hopes of being returned to their homeland. This combination of disparate figures brought the resources, motivation, and skills required to find and capture or kill bushrangers. But that's not to say it was easy. It took a lot of time and many attempts to finally kill Michael Howe, the greatest of Van Diemen's Land bushrangers, in 1818, as described in my video, Tasmania's Greatest Outlaw. Howe was caught by a team composed of a convict stockkeeper, a kangaroo hunter, and a soldier. Before them, many others had tried to catch him, including the exiled New South Wales Aboriginal warrior, Mosquito. The colonial authorities breathed a sigh of relief with Howe's death, brains bashed out by his pursuers. A biography, published not long after his death, described him as the last and the greatest of the bushrangers. He may indeed have been the greatest, but he certainly wasn't the last. And enter Matthew Brady, or Gentleman Brady, as he became known. A Manchester man, transported for 7 years in 1820, he was not a model convict of the type of Batman's father. He fought convict discipline, and he paid the price. 350 lashes over the course of his time as a convict. And finally, sent to Macquarie Harbour in Van Diemen's Land. Macquarie Harbour, like its more famous successor, Port Arthur, was the final port of call for recalcitrant convicts. Those who wouldn't toe the line and work off their sentence went there to experience brutality and confinement. But even there, Brady was not broken. He and a group of other convicts escaped, stole a small boat, and rowed up the Derwent River into the wild interior of Van Diemen's Land. There, Brady became the leader of a powerful gang of bushrangers. Many of his raids would become legendary. What gave Matthew Brady such notoriety was not just the scale of his criminal activities, but his character, and dare I say, his sense of humour. All accounts agree he was capable of behaving very courteously, especially to women, and was always mindful to avoid unnecessary killing. Combined with the ways he sought to mock the establishment, he acquired a Robin Hood-like reputation as a lovable rogue. Some accounts of his activities will illustrate this. In one instance, he and his gang raided the property of the settler, Walter Bethune. Bethune was not at home. The gang had deliberately timed their attack to coincide with his absence, probably using information provided by friendly convicts. When Bethune arrived at home later, he found Matthew Brady waiting for him in front of the property. Brady greeted the settler as if an old friend, and invited him into the house to have dinner with him. Inside, Bethune saw the table laid for the evening meal, with his family and assigned convicts all sat ready to enjoy a fine meal. They ate, while Brady's gang guarded the property from outside. They had already removed everything of value from the home. Once the meal was finished, Brady thanked Bethune for his hospitality, bid farewell to the assembled family and convicts, and set off with his gang and all Bethune's valuable goods. No one was physically harmed. On another occasion, Brady and gang went to the home of settler Mr. Young. They arrived late at night and politely asked to speak to the master of the house. Brady informed the unfortunate man that he was going to be robbed and asked if there were ladies present. Mr. Young confirmed that there were. Brady told Mr. Young to instruct the ladies to gather in one room of the house and lock the door, so that Brady's men could ransack the house without any chance of the women being harmed or excessively distressed. Mr. Young followed the instructions and Brady's men got to work. Once all but the ladies' room had been robbed, Brady told Mr. Young to get the ladies into a different room so that one remaining room could be ransacked. Gentleman Brady was obviously not too sure of the gentlemanly conduct of his followers, and so saved the women of the Young family from any chance of molestation. This policy of avoiding unnecessary harm extended to his other exploits. When they waylaid travellers and robbed them, Brady would insist that their victims swear an oath to stay exactly where they were for 30 minutes, thus giving the gang enough time to get away. Anyone who refused to swear would be tied to a tree. Being tied up in such a sparsely populated land as Van Diemen's Land obviously could result in death from exposure or starvation, but it at least gave them a chance. Brady is also reported to have driven out members of his gang who killed people without cause. This level of clemency from someone who, to be absolutely fair, was a violent criminal may leave us somewhat incredulous. I think Brady knew exactly what he was doing though. To survive as a bushranger, he needed support from convict society. Brady's actions won him adoration and thus emboldened convicts and perhaps even some free settlers to cooperate with his activities. It contrasts remarkably with the actions of some other bushrangers, such as Thomas Jeffries, operating at the same time as Brady. Now, Jeffries was a real nasty piece of work, a sometime cannibal who once dashed a baby's brains out in front of its mother. He and his friends had asked to join Brady's gang, but had been rebuffed. Brady was keeping careful control of his image. The bounty on Brady's head eventually reached 100 guineas, along with a free pardon and passage to England for any convict who captured him. John Batman didn't need the latter, but the former, the money, would no doubt be plenty welcome. The more capital he acquired, the more he could grow his estate. For as long as the bushranger crisis continued in Van Diemen's Land, Batman was moonlighting as a bounty hunter, and Brady must have been target number one. In his hunt for Brady and the bushrangers, Batman would have been becoming an ever more skilled frontiersman, skills that were going to be vital in his subsequent career. He wasn't acting alone though. One quality that Batman consistently demonstrated was always being able to find useful people and win them over to his side. He would of course have had convicts working for him. As a landowner, he was eligible to have convicts assigned to him by the government. Working as stockkeepers for Batman in his borderland estate, they would have gradually become acquainted with the bush themselves. Convicts and former convicts would be involved in all of Batman's adventures. The other key group of allies he had were Aboriginals from New South Wales. His contacts with Sydney and the Aboriginal connections there enabled him to call over Aboriginals to assist him in Van Diemen's Land. Prized for their bushcraft and linguistic skills, Batman's Aboriginals would stick with him to the very end. With increasingly talented and skilled people on the hunt for him, Brady's time was running out. Besides the generous bounties, the authorities had also infiltrated Brady's gang. A convict named Cohen was released into the bush, and he wore iron fetters as if he had just made an escape. Brady's gang took him in, and Cohen became a seemingly enthusiastic bushranger, robbing settlers at every opportunity. But when the timing was right, he left the gang in the night, met a group of soldiers, and led them to the bushranger camp. The soldiers fired their muskets and then rushed the outlaws. A fierce combat ensued, in which the bushrangers were dispersed, fleeing wildly into the bush, no longer united. Brady himself was injured, but he made his escape. Alone, Brady may have believed he would easily evade capture. The bush was an expansive, wild place in an island with a minuscule population. If it was down to the army and the convicts, he probably could have survived for a while alone. But John Batman had the skills and the allies he needed to claim the prize. Batman and his team caught up with Brady in the mountains. Batman approached the bushranger before revealing himself, weapon ready, calling on him to surrender. What ensued was a dialogue that was much retold, with variations in the literature of bushranger legend throughout the rest of the 19th century. "Are you an officer?" Brady asked while he cocked his already loaded musket. "I'm not a soldier, if that's what you mean. I'm John Batman. If you raise that gun, I'll shoot. There's no chance for you." "You're right," Brady replied. "My time's up. You're a brave man and I yield, but I'd never give in to a soldier." And so Brady met his match, a man who could put the bush to his advantage, just as the bushrangers had done. Batman won his bounty, but he got more than that. He was building a reputation as a man who could win victories in the wild environment of colonial Australia. He was increasingly noticed and respected by other settlers and by the authorities as a successful man of action. Van Diemen's Land sorely needed such men. As for Brady, he found himself in the same lockup as the aforementioned bushranger, Thomas Jeffries, baby killer, cannibal, and all-round scoundrel. Brady was disgusted that he should end his days associated with such a man. The two of them, along with some other captured bushrangers, were taken by cart to Hobart to stand trial, and the whole way, Brady did his best to demonstrate publicly how revolted he was to be anywhere near Jeffries. It was while they were awaiting trial that convict artist Thomas Brock drew their portraits. That they were sentenced to death by hanging is no great surprise. More frustrating for the authorities, though, was that the women in attendance at the proceedings wept as the announcement of Brady's sentence was made. Brady, Jeffries, and 3 other bushrangers were hanged together in Hobart Town. While bushranging would continue in Van Diemen's Land for many decades yet, the great age of the Van Diemensian bushranger, threatening the very stability and functioning of the colony, was already long over. The political culture of the island was changing too. Van Diemen's Land's first governors had been a fairly jovial, almost buccaneering group of characters, taking a relatively forgiving approach to convict discipline, fathering children with convict mistresses, and in the case of Van Diemen's Land's second governor, taking the time to memorialize his administration with the invention of a particularly potent cocktail that he christened Blow My Skull. See the recipe on the screen. But colonial life nearly came unstuck with the great success of the bushrangers. Van Diemen's Land third governor, William Sorel, had achieved a great deal in bringing the bushranger crisis to an end, but there was obviously still the sense that the colony needed shaking up. The man to do the shaking arrived in May 1824, Van Diemen's Land's most consequential colonial governor, George Arthur. Arthur was a child of that same evangelical revival that had provided Batman with his education and was sweeping the British Empire with the spirit of moral reform. Arthur had previously been governor of British Honduras, what we would now call Belize in Central America. There he had developed a reputation as a defender of native rights and opponent of the interests of slaveholders. Exactly the kind of reputation you want to have in the new moral environment. Arthur arrived in Van Diemen's Land with the mission to restore and maintain order, to implement firm convict discipline, to settle the interior of the country, and in accordance with the reigning evangelical humanitarian ideology, to foster positive relations with the Aboriginals. And yet, the early years of his administration would be defined by conflict with the Tasmanian natives. As the bushranger menace receded, settlement further inland, away from the original centres of British population at the Derwent and Port Dalrymple, rapidly expanded until there was a strip of British presence across the centre of the island. This was not dense settlement. We're talking about huts, homesteads, clearings for sheep, not the emergence of towns. On paper, many of the new land claims were vast, but many were barely utilised. Nonetheless, British presence had expanded greatly and quickly, bisecting the island, and thus coming into ever greater contact with the original inhabitants. This greater contact, far from leading to greater understanding between the races, led to the conflict known to history as the Black War. There is no part of Van Diemen's Land's history, perhaps Australian history as a whole, as controversial as the Black War. The war's causes, the motivations of participants, the manner of combat, the details of events are all heavily disputed and have been a key battleground of Australia's so-called history wars. Some very hot debates about Australian colonial history. Even the question of when the war actually began is disputed. The fundamental problem for studying and understanding the conflict is that one side, the Aboriginals, were a hunter-gatherer society with Stone Age technology and very limited political organisation. They didn't have a state as we know it, so there was no declaration of war, nor a formal treaty to end the conflict, no announcement of specific war aims, not even a verbal statement from an Aboriginal leader in a position to represent Aboriginal interests in general. Just as Batman had volunteered his energies in the battle against the bushrangers in order to win financial rewards and garner favour with the colonial leadership, he did just the same in the fight against the settlers' Aboriginal enemies. But who were these enemies, and why did they fight? The Tasmanian Aboriginals were generally grouped into around 10 tribes. The precise number isn't absolutely clear, but these tribes were linguistic or cultural groups, not political units. The main Aboriginal social unit was the Band, which in eastern Van Diemen's Land, where the Black War took place, numbered between 40 and 70 people. Technologically, they were less advanced than their cousins in mainland Australia. Their primary weapons were the sharpened wooden spear and the wooden club. Unlike those of New South Wales, the Tasman spear was not barbed, just smooth wood all the way down to the point, making it significantly less deadly. Data on British deaths in the conflict show that in a majority of killings, the fatal blow was made with a club, though the spear was often used to first wound or incapacitate the settler. Aboriginal attacks typically took place in the day, nearly always against isolated settlers, convicts, or farms in the interior of the country, where it was very difficult for the British to mount an organised response. In the great majority of cases, the killings were accompanied by the looting of important British goods. The Tasmanians valued British flour, potatoes, and blankets. These were all things they could not produce themselves, and they gave Tasmanian warriors greater flexibility of movement in the bush. The flour and potatoes gave them an easily portable and long-lasting food source, in contrast to the bushmeat that was their main diet, and the blankets enabled them to sleep without fires, thereby making them harder to catch at night. It is possible that these were conscious decisions, acquiring these particular goods precisely because they enabled them to wage their war against the British more effectively. Sometimes they also attacked the things that made British settled life possible. They drove off sheep, sliced the legs of cattle, set fire to property. Where killing took place, it is sometimes claimed, by British sources, that the victims had previously wronged the Tasmanians in some way, whether in disputes over women or in by killing Aboriginals. Tasman attacks could be horrifically brutal. Women and children made up a significant portion of their victims, about 10% in total. In 1828, the home of Patrick Gow was attacked, but Patrick himself was not at home. His wife and 3 children were unprotected. Despite begging for the lives of her children, Patrick's wife Esther Gow and her 4-year-old daughter were both speared and clubbed to death, while another 2 Gow family members were badly injured, including a 13-month-old baby. Their neighbour, another woman, Anne Geary, was also killed. Such is the brutality of frontier violence between wildly different cultures with irreconcilable ambitions. What we have then are various forms of violence committed against the British, some focusing on destroying property, some on looting, some killings of settlers, and some on the murder of innocents. It does not appear systematic, and it isn't always easy to know the exact motivation for a particular attack, while we have little to go on for understanding Aboriginal motivations firsthand. The numbers of attacks increased dramatically in the last years of the 1820s. Why? Simply saying the British presence as invaders was the cause doesn't help us understand why large-scale fighting took place now, in the 1820s, and not when the British first arrived. It seems a number of factors are involved. The wider British settlement meant there was more chance of offence being felt, particularly disputes over Aboriginal women and over hunting, quite conventional casus belli in Aboriginal society. The wider spread of the British also meant there were now many more vulnerable, isolated British homesteads containing the goods the Tasmanians craved, a tempting target. Additionally, by this time, the Tasmanians had met Aboriginals from New South Wales, presumably for the first time since Tasmania separated from mainland Australia 12,000 years ago. Mosquito was a warrior from the Hawkesbury River who had been exiled from New South Wales, first to Norfolk Island and then to Van Diemen's Land, and he became there a bounty hunter before turning his back for the last time on the British and joining the Tasmanians as a fighter against white settlement. He and some other Sydney blacks who went native in Van Diemen's Land may well have communicated to the Tasmanians the way their homelands had been conquered by the British over the preceding decades. All these motivations, desire for loot, offence at the actions of individual settlers or convicts, fear for the future, could all have existed side by side and impelled the Tasmanians to increase their attacks on the British. How did the British meet this challenge? While the Tasmanian weapons were primitive, the British had problems of their own. Guns were not the advantage in Van Diemen's Land that many might assume. The British were using muskets. You got one shot from them before resorting to melee. The Aboriginals knew this, and they would wait for the British to fire off their shot before charging. In the wet environment of the bush, surrounded by foliage, the powder often got wet, and so the weapons misfired, thus being completely useless in many cases. The weapons were also incredibly inaccurate generally, but even more so in the hands of convict stockkeepers in the bush, who often had no military training. In other colonial settings, the great weapon of Europeans against indigenous enemies was often the horse, and yet this advantage was largely unavailable in Van Diemen's Land, where horses were few and far between, an expensive luxury at this time. This was a war fought on foot by both sides. While the convicts and settlers in the bush were routinely armed, the army of convicts being one of the most remarkable features of penal life in Van Diemen's Land, George Arthur favoured taking the fight to the Tasmanians, rather than waiting for them to attack. Military patrols were sent through the bush to catch enemy bands, but the number of soldiers being so small, the authorities had to resort to civilian-run and civilian-manned patrols, called roving parties. The first two roving parties were set up by George Robinson, a free settler, son of a Caribbean plantation owner and slave mother, and Jorg Jorgensen, a Danish adventurer, one-time self-styled King of Iceland, who'd been sent into political exile in Australia. John Batman established a third roving party. In typical John Batman style, he led a roving party formed of both convicts and Sydney blacks, the latter providing important bushcraft skills. Their mission was to roam the bush, in Batman's case in the northeast of the island near to his Ben Lomond estate, and catch enemy bands. In theory, they were only supposed to fight enemy tribes, not all Aboriginals indiscriminately. George Arthur and the British authorities did not see themselves as at war with the Tasmanians generally, but only with certain tribes. They overestimated political unity within the tribes. In reality, the decision to fight was made by the bands, the real unit of Aboriginal social life. George Arthur also overestimated the ability of British settlers to distinguish between groups of Aboriginals. The reality is that the British on the ground had virtually no way to know which bands were friendly, and the conflict became increasingly generalised. The authorities made matters worse by offering £5 reward for captured Aboriginals, only to see a flurry of kidnappings against friendly tribes, and Arthur was forced to make a second proclamation clarifying that the reward was only for enemy Tasmanians, not friendly natives. The Tasmanians usually attacked in the day. The British would attack at night. In the daytime, it was easy for the Tasmanians to get away with their superior knowledge of the bush. With a night attack, the British roving parties hoped to have better success, catching their enemies unprepared before they could make an escape. As the leader of a roving party, Batman reported to George Arthur himself, and in the following letter recounted a violent encounter while on patrol. And here I quote Batman directly. "In pursuit of the Aborigines, who have been committing so many outrages in this district, I fell in with their tracks and followed them with the assistance of the Sydney native blacks until we came to a number of huts. We proceeded in the same direction until we saw some smoke at a distance. I immediately ordered the men to lay down. We could hear the natives conversing distinctly. We then crept into a thick scrub and remained there until after sunset, and made towards them with the greatest caution. At about 11 o'clock p.m, we arrived within 21 paces of them. The men were drawn up on the right by my orders, intending to rush upon them before they could arise from the ground, hoping that I should not be under the necessity of firing at them. But unfortunately, as the last man was coming up, he struck his musket against that of another party, which immediately alarmed the dogs, in number about 40. They came directly at us. The natives arose from the ground and were in the act of running away into a thick scrub when I ordered the men to fire upon them, which was done, and a rush by the party immediately followed. We only captured that night one woman and a male child about 2 years old. Next morning, we found one man very badly wounded in the ankle and knee. Shortly after, we found another 10 buckshot had entered his body. He was alive, but very bad. There were a great number of traces of blood in various directions, and we learned from those we took that 10 men were wounded in the body, which they gave us to understand were dead or would die. 2 women in the same state had crawled away, besides a number that was shot in the legs. We shot 21 dogs and tamed a great number of spears, waddies, blankets, rugs, knives, a tomahawk, shingle wrench, etc., etc. Friday morning, we left the place for my farm with the 2 men, woman, and child, but found it impossible that the 2 former could walk, and after trying them by every means in my power for some time, found I could not get them on. I was obliged to shoot them. Later, Batman would claim that the 2 Aboriginals he executed had tried to escape, probably because he got a negative reaction from George Arthur for so blatantly saying he shot his prisoners. This in turn likely reflects a disparity between the British in the towns and the British in the bush. It was very important to the authorities that a reconciliation be made with the Tasmanians, while in the bush, the settlers dealt with the reality of fear, violence, and vengeance. Nonetheless, Batman seems to have learned something from the experience. If not from humanitarianism, then from politics, he would need to be active in making that reconciliation happen. Ever the opportunist, he made efforts to be involved in building bridges with the Tasmanians, and Governor Arthur would come to see him as a man inclined to peace. For all that, the roving parties were not a success. Gilbert Robertson and George Jorgensen both accused each other of being lackluster and incompetent in their patrols. Batman pursued them with notable energy for a time, but later his enthusiasm was dampened, probably by the discovery that it isn't much fun running after enemies who cannot be distinguished from friends and risking censure for getting it wrong. A military problem that persists in annoying Western forces up to modern times. Frustrated in his initial efforts, distressed at the escalation of violence, George Arthur decided to bet everything on one dramatic plan: the infamous Black Line. This audacious plan involved forming a human line across a vast stretch of the east of the island and marching south, driving the Aboriginals ahead of them and finally cooping them up in the Tasman Peninsula in the southeast of Van Diemen's Land. The objective was to clear this territory of enemy bands and exile them to the Tasman Peninsula, where they could live separately from the British until such time as they could be reconciled to the British presence in Van Diemen's Land. To understand how risky this was for George Arthur, we must return to evangelicalism and Arthur's previous career. The bedrock of his career and reputation was as a Christian and a humanitarian. If his men marched south and killed every Aboriginal they came across, coating the island and Arthur's reputation in blood, then he'd be finished. Instructions were issued that the Aboriginals were to be pushed south, captured if possible, but not killed. Would the Black Line be able to perform to Arthur's intentions? Yes and no. It emphatically did not kill many Tasmanians. In fact, it killed only 2. It captured only 2. It pushed absolutely no Tasmanians into the Tasman Peninsula. At great financial cost, a project that involved 20% of the entire island's British population was seemingly a complete and embarrassing failure. This could have ended Arthur's career. But it didn't. Despite the apparent defeat, the Black Line won the war for the British and ensured Arthur would go on to an ever grander colonial career, ultimately becoming the governor of Bombay. The fundamental political objective of the Black Line, separating the Aboriginals from the British, was in fact achieved. How? Operating in the bush at this time was George Augustus Robertson. Batman and Robertson knew each other well. Robertson had come earlier to the same conclusion as Batman, that favour with the authorities lay in finding peaceable approaches to the Tasmanians, and by the time of the Black Line, he had spent many months traversing the bush speaking to, negotiating with, and occasionally kidnapping Aboriginals in the hope of convincing them to accept a peace settlement with the authorities. He had had very little success until the Black Line. The Black Line demonstrated the power of the British in a way lonely convict stockkeepers in the bush could not. The level of organisation, extent of manpower and resources that was necessary to organise the Black Line was beyond anything the Tasmanians could imagine, and they knew it. Increasing numbers of them started agreeing to Robertson's pleas that they surrender themselves to him, which ultimately meant their exile to Flinders Island in the Bass Strait, which would be established as an Aboriginal colony under Robertson's management. There it was hoped they would become Christians and good British subjects. Instead, they would rapidly die of disease. The Black War was over. Before proceeding with Batman's next adventure, let's take a moment to consider who this man was. His ability to win allies was a significant part of his success, so he was charismatic, but not everyone liked him. Let's consider some assessments from his contemporaries. His earliest biographer, James Bonwick, lived in Van Diemen's Land early enough to get impressions from people who actually knew him, and he reports this. "And what have I heard? They told me stories of bloodthirsty natives brought in by the bold hunter and retained by his spirit of kindness. They spoke of wondrous feats of horseback, bush tracking, endurance of hunger, thirst and fatigue, and a successful capture of dreadful armed outlaws. I learned that this man of iron nerve, of powerful frame and daring courage had the manners of a gentleman and the simplicity of a child, the tenderness of a woman." Such is the reputation Batman left behind him in Van Diemen's Land, no doubt to some extent polished by the passage of time. Bonwick does temper this portrayal by noting Batman was known for his overfondness both for drink and for women. A far more negative assessment comes from Batman's neighbour in northeast Van Diemen's Land, the great colonial artist John Glover. "A rogue, thief, cheat, liar, a murderer of blacks, and the vilest man I have ever known." Well, blimey, that is quite a contrary assessment. How to reconcile such contrary perspectives? Those who made a success of colonial Australia did so with a combination of skill, hard work, extreme acquisitiveness, and staying just on the right side of the law. Batman is no exception to this pattern. Factor in his background too, the son of a convict, Australian-born when virtually everyone of note was British-born. Something of the rogue was probably needed in his character if he was to succeed. As for being a murderer of blacks, one should bear in mind how divided was British colonial society over the Black War. Arthur's policies had many critics, and contempt for the convicts at the forefront of the struggle was deep and widespread, while those same convicts were often blamed for causing the war. I don't want to write off the views of Batman's detractors completely, but he was a colonial frontiersman of working class origins and a convict father dealing with a society that exhibited very great class prejudice. You may make your own decision on whether or not he was a good or a bad man. What is certain is that he possessed immense energy, great physical prowess, powerful charisma, and that his actions on his subsequent and last adventure were directly responsible for the foundation of one of the world's great cities, thus making John Batman a man of history. There is one more factor that we must consider in trying to understand this man. He had syphilis. As we enter the next stage of his career, the effects of the disease were just starting to become obvious, a small piece of his nose beginning to rot away. Batman must have known his time was running out. If he was going to achieve great things, he had to act fast before his body failed him. By 1835, we find John Batman in a position many would have been contented with. He owned 600 acres of land, he had a growing family with his wife, having a wife being itself a significant achievement in colonial Van Diemen's Land. He had the respect of the authorities and some of his peers among landowners. He had achieved all this despite being born the son of an exiled convict. But the same energy that propelled Batman to this success, that had won him allies among all classes and victories over the bushrangers, pushed him to further ventures. Being a middling Van Diemen's Land landowner was not enough. Batman had his sights on his yet unclaimed territory back across the Bass Strait. Along with most of continental Australia, Port Phillip, i.e. what is now Melbourne in the Australian state of Victoria, was theoretically part of New South Wales, and had been so since Captain Cook formally annexed 2/3 of the continent after arriving at Botany Bay in 1770. But that was a legalistic move intended to ward off other European powers from competing with Britain in any future colonisation, which in the event didn't even begin for another 18 years. The fact was, British settlement in 1835 was confined to a slice of territory along the coast around Sydney, Norfolk Island, and Van Diemen's Land. The rest of claimed British territory was a paper colony. British authorities in London favoured this limit to colonisation. Why? Well, for one thing, penal colonies, as the British state was learning, were horribly expensive. Australia was never a cheap way to dispose of British criminals. But just as important was that same evangelical humanitarian concern for the natives. The government fearing that it would lose any ability to regulate relations between natives, settlers and convicts if settlement expanded too quickly. They were right, but they were going to lose control anyway. As so often with empire, the men on the ground favoured far more radical expansion than authorities in the imperial centre. The key man on the ground in our story is John Batman. An attempt at settling Port Phillip as a penal colony had been made in 1803, but had been abandoned. The soldiers and convicts were moving to Van Diemen's Land. When they left, an escaped convict, William Buckley, was left behind. Buckley went native, assimilating into the culture of the local Aboriginals, the Kulin people, among whom he lived for the next 30 years. He will be there, and will be a figure of some importance, when Batman later arrives. Despite the initial failure to colonise Port Phillip, rumours about its suitability for settlement continued, kindled by an 1824 exploration of the region, the Hume and Hovell expedition. Now, as it happens, Hamilton Hume of that expedition was Batman's old school friend, and had spoken personally to Batman about the territory. As easy land claims in Van Diemen's Land dried up, the more ambitious settlers started looking north. Batman's residence in Van Diemen's Land was situated just below the mountain Ben Lomond. Just as it appeals to campers and hikers today, in 1834 a party of outdoorsmen ascended the mountain. The party included many respectable, high-ranking Van Diemen's Landers. Batman and his closest allies within the establishment had clearly organised the trip as an opportunity to propose their ideas for settling Port Phillip to potential Confederates. One of the party, William Sams, related it this way. It was then that I first heard Port Phillip spoken of as a desirable place for settlement. Batman telling me that when he was in Sydney, he had heard from a schoolfellow, Hamilton Hume, who with Captain Hovell had explored the neighbourhood of Port Phillip, that the country there was of the finest description, and that this information had dwelt in his mind, and made him anxious to verify the truth or otherwise of the report. It then occurred to me to suggest the formation of a company, in order that the expenses incidental to the exploration should be light when borne by a number. The idea was at once agreed upon, and forthwith proceeded with. The Ben Lomond trip had the intended effect, and the Port Phillip Association was formed. Its membership included a range of influential Van Diemen's Landers. To give just a few examples, the association included such as James Helder Wedge, a land surveyor for the Van Diemen's Land government, who had also been involved in hunting bushrangers and was a long-time friend of Batman's; Charles Swanston, a member of the Legislative Council, friend of Governor Arthur, and manager of Derwent Bank. He was the lead financier; and Joseph Tice Gillibrand, a lawyer, former Attorney General for Van Diemen's Land, who had been a vocal advocate for respecting the rights of the Aboriginals during the Black War. Other association members were in a similar mould, mid to high-ranking Van Diemen's Landers with official positions and important connections. It is Batman who stands out as having relatively modest social origins. Only one association member was a former convict, and he acted essentially as a silent partner. Next to these respectable and influential colonial figures, what did Batman bring to the table? He was the man of action, who was needed to overthrow the colonial status quo. Port Phillip was Crown land. In theory, it had been so since Cook had annexed it to the realms of King George III half a lifetime ago. What is sometimes seen as the height of imperial arrogance was at least partly intended to reduce the ravages of colonialism upon the natives, because as Crown land, the unoccupied parts of New South Wales could not legally be freely occupied and taken over by private initiative. And yet this is exactly what the association intended to do. So what was the Port Phillip Association's plan? John Batman would lead an expedition funded by the association with a team of his Sydney blacks and ex-convict employees to Port Phillip, explore the area, find suitable land for settlement, and then acquire this land through signing a treaty with the local natives. He was expressly not to engage in violent military conquest. The signing of a treaty was absolutely foundational to the plan. This treaty, it was hoped, would demonstrate to the British government that private enterprise colonization could be done in a way that avoided the tragedies of Van Diemen's Land's recent history. The association also intended their scheme to be absolutely convict-free. They wanted Port Phillip to be Australia's first non-penal colony, a respectable colony of free settlers living at peace with the natives. And so, in 1835, with the backing of his friends in the association, John Batman prepared to leave Van Diemen's Land for Port Phillip to claim this vast territory for himself and his associates. The Bass Strait that separates Tasmania from the mainland of Australia is a tempestuous stretch of water embattled by the great westerlies, the powerful winds that push from west to east in the South Seas. These winds give Tasmania its wet, temperate climate, and they make crossing to the mainland by sailing ship particularly challenging. John Batman, with his team of former convicts, Sydney Blacks and a hired crew and ship, were watching the sea daily from the north coast of Van Diemen's Land from the 11th of May 1835, waiting for favourable weather that would enable their crossing. They boarded and reboarded again and again as the prospects for good weather looked good, only to be disappointed over and over. They distracted themselves with drinking bouts in Launceston and Georgetown, with hunting and fishing around Port Sorel. As Batman relates in his journal, this was most annoying to lose so much time and be beating and knocking about so much at sea and gaining no ground whatever. As days became weeks, Batman's wife Eliza even turned up to rejoin him, though he quickly sent her back to Launceston. The man was filled with nervous energy, his thoughts preoccupied with conquest, with new lands. When shall we get away from this? I am almost mad, but must wait with patience. Finally, on the 27th, the weather cleared. Really this time. They made it to Hunter Island, and the next day they could truly cross the Bass Strait, sighting the land we now call Victoria on the 29th of May after 18 days of painful suspense. The next day he set foot on his promised land. I went on shore to look at the land, which appeared beautiful, with scarcely any timber on. On my landing, I found the hills of a most superior description, beyond my most sanguine expectations, the land excellent and very rich, and light black soil. Spotting excellent land for settlement was only half his purpose. He had to find natives and make a treaty with them. The next day, he and his party were on the search and came upon a native village of several huts, but the natives themselves were not present. They were able to track the natives, and when they found themselves gaining on them, Batman's party split into two. His Sydney Blacks, stripped of their British clothes, naked in the Aboriginal manner, went ahead to make contact while Batman and the other Englishmen stayed behind. Once the Sydney Blacks had made the Englishmen's peaceful intentions clear, they called Batman and the other whites to come forward. He found himself in contact with a group of about 20 women and their children. A friendly atmosphere was achieved by the Sydney Blacks singing and dancing for their new friends, whose languages were intelligible to one another. Batman gave gifts to the women. 8 pair blankets, 30 handkerchiefs, 1 tomahawk, 18 necklaces of beads, 6 pounds sugar, 12 looking glasses, and a quantity of apples. And according to Batman, the women were very happy with what they got. Batman in turn received gifts from the women in the form of baskets and spears. Batman promised to meet the women again the next day. Batman's party would spend the next several days exploring their new country. They hunted, dug for water, and named the local landmarks for his followers, supporters, and prominent Van Diemen's Landers. Gums Well after his ex-convict employee, Mount Wedge after his association member, Arthur Plains for the governor of Van Diemen's Land. He was giddy about what he saw. I never saw or could suppose there could be so extensive plains as I saw today. 5,000 sheep would be almost lost upon them. But the mission remained incomplete until he had made a treaty with the locals. After nearly a week of surveying the country, he and his party came across some tracks and followed them. We walked about 8 miles when we fell in with the tracks of the natives, and shortly after came up with a family, 1 chief, his wife, and 3 children. I gave him a pair of blankets, handkerchiefs, beads, and 3 knives. He then went on with us and crossed a freshwater creek. The land on each side excellent. He took us on, saying he would take us to the tribe, and mentioned the names of chiefs. We walked about 8 miles when, to our great surprise, we heard several voices calling after us. On looking back, we saw 8 men, all armed with spears. When we stopped, they threw aside their weapons and came very friendly up to us. After shaking hands, and by giving them tomahawks, knives, etc., they took us with them about a mile back, where we found huts, women, and children. After some time and full explanation, I found 8 chiefs amongst them who possessed the whole of the territory near Port Phillip. 3 brothers, all of the same name, were the principal chiefs, and 2 of them men of 6 feet high and very good looking. The other not so tall, but stouter. The other 5 chiefs were fine men. After a full explanation of what my object was, I purchased 2 large tracts of land from them, about 600,000 acres, more or less, and delivered over to them blankets, knives, looking glasses, tomahawks, beads, scissors, flowers, etc., etc., as payment for the land, and also agreed to give them a tribute or rent yearly. The parchment the 8 chiefs signed this afternoon, delivering to me some of the soil, each of them as giving me full possession of the tracts of land. This took place alongside a beautiful stream of water, and from whence my land commences, and where a tree is marked 4 ways to know the corner boundary. The next day, Batman met the chiefs again, and had them mark 3 copies of deeds confirming the purchase. The chief presented Batman with cloaks that he described as royal mantles, and that they were very happy to see him wearing them. Batman then asked the chiefs to make sacred marks on a prominent tree, his understanding being that this was necessary for the deal to be finalized in the local culture. His account suggests that the chiefs were at first a little unsure if they should engage in such a ceremony, but were finally persuaded to do so. Batman's Sydney Blacks making marks on the same tree alongside those of the locals. John Batman knew what he'd like this location to be known as. The banks of the river, which I have named Batman Creek, after my own good self. Mission accomplished. Batman had his treaty and a dealed record of the events in the form of his journal to present to the authorities. He was intoxicated with the vision of a new colony, a colony at peace with the natives, where endless plains of sheep made himself and other adventurers wealthy, where free men, rather than convicts, would establish themselves in peace and prosperity. The next day, he prepared to leave for Van Diemen's Land, to make his claim to the authorities and collect his property for a final move to Port Phillip. He was leaving some of his Aboriginal and former convict employees behind to keep an eye on the situation and manage relations with the locals. They were also to be his muscle. Ex-convict Gum was given written permission to put off any person or persons that may trespass on the land I have purchased from the natives. As he prepared to leave, he saw a well-watered spot along the River Yarra and commented in his diary, "This will be the place for a village." It would in fact be the place for the great city of Melbourne. John Batman returned to Van Diemen's Land to Launceston, the North Coast's largest town, and went quickly to a pub. Because you would, wouldn't you? There he announced himself, over his cups, as the greatest landowner in the world. He said this in an establishment owned by one of history's greatest publicans, /hoteliers, /adventuring colonialist. It was the hotel belonging to John Pascoe Faulkner, a man who, along with, or in contrast to Batman, is often described as the founder or the father of Melbourne. While pouring the man his drinks, Faulkner was listening carefully to Batman's boastful tale of an epic land purchase on the other side of the Bass Strait. As it happens, Faulkner himself had been to Port Phillip already, 32 years before, as a child, as part of that unsuccessful 1803 attempt to colonize the territory that I've already mentioned. Much like Batman, his father was a convict, and his family accompanied his father on the journey to Australia. Unlike Batman, he was born in England and thus not technically a currency lad, leaving the old world with the rest of his family at the age of 10. If Batman was the golden boy of adventurous colonial youth, winning friends wherever he went, rising up the hierarchy, exchanging letters with governors and winning fame for his daring exploits, Faulkner's story was much less glamorous. Unlike the relatively settled environment of Parramatta, Faulkner's adolescence was spent in the privation of freshly claimed Van Diemen's Land. He lost the use of his leg for several months as a child there for lack of suitable nutrition. It was a tough life. However, His father, like Batman's, made good of his transportation, won his freedom, and owned his own farm. By 1811, John Faulkner also had his own farm right next to his father's, where the family grew wheat and raised sheep and cows. Faulkner himself stayed in Hobart Town, where he managed a shop for his father and set himself up as a baker. But in only a few years, it all went terribly wrong. He assisted a group of convicts in acquiring a boat to escape Van Diemen's Land. The boat was leaky and the plan failed, and all the convicts were captured. Faulkner himself, of course, had never been a convict, but now he was sentenced to 500 lashes and 3 years hard labour. In a reversal of the usual pattern, Faulkner had come to Australia as a free man, or boy, and then had become a convict. He completed his sentence in New South Wales and then returned to Van Diemen's Land, becoming a baker again and also a liquor seller. But corrupt practices landed both him and his father in trouble once again, his father being punished with a short return to convict discipline and his son leaving Hobart in disgrace. He went to Launceston and decided to reinvent himself as a builder. Here he met and married a convict woman, as it happens, named Eliza, the same given name as John Batman's wife. Faulkner's bride had been transported for the crime of stealing a baby. From this point, things started to turn for the better. He saved up the capital to open a hotel, the Cornwall Hotel, which he ran with his wife in Launceston. He dabbled in countless other forms of business, from horticulture to journalism, and his wealth grew. Australia was, in its own particular way, a land of opportunity, but it didn't serve to be timid. Men of Faulkner's and Batman's working-class English heritage needed to be determined and opportunistic if they were to transcend their origins. To us, they may seem grasping in a less than endearing way, but we have to understand them in their own times and in their own terms. From near the bottom of a highly hierarchical society, transported to the far side of the earth, they needed to be made of powerful stuff if they were to rise high. Batman had his physical strength, his stamina, his charisma, his skill as an outdoorsman. Faulkner had his adaptability, his intelligence. They both had energy, grit, and determination in spades. Now, while pouring drinks for the jubilant Batman, Faulkner set his ambition on crossing the Bass Strait and making his own claim to the new territory. Batman's boasting may seem reckless, but in some sense it had its purpose. Their plan rested on the need to get recognition, so secrecy was out of the question. The Port Phillip Association publicised the expedition and treaty with the Aboriginals, setting the collective imagination of Van Diemen's Land on fire. In the words of one Reverend Lang, Van Diemen's Land had been suddenly electrified. I happened to visit that island on a clerical tour from New South Wales in the months of October and November 1835, when the excitement was at its height, and traversing the island to and fro between Hobart Town and Launceston, I found almost every respectable person I met with, either individually or in the person of some near relative or confidential agent, anxious to occupy the Australian El Dorado. The first to act was a man named John Aitken. He crossed the Bass Strait and claimed some land for himself outside that claimed by John Batman. John Faulkner knew he had to act fast, but he was handicapped by his debts. His creditors would not permit him to leave Launceston. So instead, he formed a group of would-be settlers and sent them across in his stead, with instructions to claim him suitable land for when he could cross over himself. He finally did so in October, but by then, other Van Diemen's Landers had already decided to strike out for opportunity in Port Phillip. One of Launceston's newspapers, the Cornwall Chronicle, called Batman the Tasmanian Pen, an allusion to William Penn, who had established a privately owned colony in North America that became Pennsylvania. The comparison was flattering, but Batman and the Port Phillip Association needed official recognition, not just popular enthusiasm. Governor Arthur, for his part, was supportive. Indeed, it is possible that he was in on the plan from the start. Certainly he knew personally many of the association members, not least his own young nephew. He personally visited Batman in Launceston to inspect his preparations for his return to Port Phillip, and he expressed an interest to the Colonial Office in London of having Port Phillip made a part of Van Diemen's Land, a subsidiary colony in the way Van Diemen's Land had once been so of New South Wales. Arthur had much to gain from such an arrangement. While many of his predecessors had died poor, Arthur had got the knack of turning his premiership to profit. Political control of the new territories would give him an advantage in land speculation of the kind that had already made him wealthy in Van Diemen's Land. Unsurprisingly, Governor Bourke of New South Wales was less supportive than his Van Diemensian counterpart. Port Phillip, if not actually occupied by Britain, was, at least in theory, Crown land in the jurisdiction of New South Wales. In August, a mere 2 months after Batman's expedition, when news could not yet have reached London, Bourke made an official proclamation on the matter. "It has been represented to me that divers of His Majesty's subjects have taken possession of vacant lands of the Crown, within the limits of this colony, under the pretence of a treaty bargain or contract for the purchase thereof with the Aboriginal natives. Now therefore I, the Governor, in virtue and in exercise of the power and authority in me vested, do hereby proclaim and notify to all His Majesty's subjects and others who it may concern, that every such treaty, bargain and contract with the Aboriginal natives, as aforesaid, for the possession, title or claim to any lands lying and being within the limits of the government of the colony of New South Wales, is void and of no effect against the rights of the Crown, and that all persons who shall be found in possession of any such lands, as aforesaid, without the license or authority of His Majesty's government for such purpose first had and obtained, will be considered as trespassers, and liable to be dealt with in like manner as other intruders upon the vacant lands of the Crown within the said colony." This proclamation had the temporary effect of reducing crossings to the new territory, and a few of the Port Phillip Association members dropped out. The game wasn't up yet though. The association had its friends in London pushing for a recognition of their claims. But the association's dream of a monopolised land claim, a privately run colony like those that once existed in colonial North America, were not to be. This is not to say that their actions came to nothing. On the contrary, they unwittingly created an avalanche of colonisation in southern Australia. In London, the House of Commons Select Committee on Aborigines had the job of coming up with policy to defend the rights of the Aboriginal population in Australia and elsewhere in the British Empire. A body dominated by evangelicals, it took its humanitarian mission to protect the natives very seriously. This protection did not necessarily entail preventing the act of British settlement itself, though that was indeed the conclusion it came to in some cases. When it came to Port Phillip, the Select Committee was heavily influenced by its interpretation of events in the Van Diemen's Land Black War. It blamed the outbreak of violence on the presence of convicts in the bush. These convicts abused the Aboriginals, driving them to the extremities of antagonism with the British community. As I've already discussed, convicts were easy to blame, and the class prejudice of the day made this view of events very believable. Colonisation itself, then, was not the problem, rather the type of colonisation. So, the Select Committee decided in favour of allowing the settlement of Port Phillip to continue, but the British government stood by Bourke's proclamation against private land purchases from the natives. Port Phillip would be colonised, but not by the Port Phillip Association. Instead, the territory would be open for settlement on the basis of land grants and purchases from the government. It would remain part of New South Wales and would be a settlement of free people rather than convicts. It would not be a penal colony like Van Diemen's Land or the other districts of New South Wales. The sale of land, by the government that is, not the Aboriginals, would be used to fund an Aboriginal protectorate which would fulfill the task of looking after the interests of the original inhabitants without the need for any treaty. After all, the Aboriginals, whether they knew it or not, were British subjects whose rights as such must be defended. This Aboriginal protectorate would be run by none other than George Augustus Robertson, who we last met in Van Diemen's Land, and had since become a renowned figure for his apparent efforts at defending Aboriginal interests. A good word about him had been made to the Select Committee by George Arthur when he returned to England in 1837. So while the government shared the association's antipathy to convict settlement and hoped for better relations with the Aboriginals, it believed the best way to achieve this was for the government to keep legal control of the land. Batman and his friends had their vision of a settlement by private company denied. Was the Select Committee on Aborigines correct that rejecting the treaty and establishing government settlement as going to be better for the Kulin people, that is, the local Aboriginals? Flatly, no. Instead of orderly settlement, there was a free-for-all as Britons moved from Van Diemen's Land and Sydney to Port Phillip, hoping to emulate Batman, and the government found itself unable to impose the kind of regulation it envisaged. As it turned out, free settlers were just as capable of falling out with the Aboriginals as convicts, and so Port Phillip would have its own manifestation of the British-Aboriginal conflict in the years to come. What had Batman and his allies been doing while waiting for the government response? Batman himself spent a surprisingly long time back in Van Diemen's Land. He first sent his brother Henry across the strait to look to his interests there and prepare his property. It is possible that John's return to Port Phillip was delayed by his declining health. He did eventually move himself, his family, and a prefabricated house to the Yarra River, but by now he could sense his dreams starting to evaporate. He continued to use his old advantages, that charisma that won him useful allies. He had not only his Sydney blacks and white employees, but had now his personal relationship with the Aboriginal tribes of the region. He also brought William Buckley, the runaway convict gone native, into his employment. Buckley was a very useful supporter as a cultural and linguistic bridge between the British and the Aboriginal world, though some doubted his loyalty to British society. The presence of other unauthorized settlers caused a fierce internal debate within the association. How to deal with these unwelcome interlopers? According to a letter written by association member Mr. Wedge, Batman suggested using the Aboriginals to violently drive them out. This plan was strenuously attacked by Wedge, who went as far as to threaten to resign if it was carried out. Batman would deny that he ever had this plan. Wedge must have got the idea from somewhere though. I'm in two minds about it. On the one hand, an energetic move seems in character for Batman. On the other, the whole premise of their plan was to avoid a conflict if they were to get government approval for their actions. Deliberately starting a war between the Aboriginals and the British would certainly have brought government ire upon them. However, it may well have been the suggestion of a desperate man. His health was becoming rapidly worse. While the news that the association would not monopolise Port Phillip must have been greatly frustrating for all involved, association members, being mostly respectable and well-off Van Diemen's Landers, still had a more than average chance of profiting handsomely from the new rush to colonisation. Many of them would do well and would die not as Van Diemen's Landers, but as Victorians. John Batman himself had everything he needed to make a success as a grazier. He should have been one of the greatest of the squatters, that is, the powerful and wealthy men grazing sheep on vast stretches of land on a scale unimaginable to men in England. But one of his key advantages was slipping away. His energy, his health. His nose was increasingly a memory as syphilis ate away his face and movement became painful. Being ever more immobile required him to transition from grazing to life as a stationary trader, hardly the kind of work you would imagine this adventurer excelling in. Indeed, it did not seem to suit him, and debts started to pile up. Having married a physically powerful, energetic and handsome man whose ambition carried him to ever greater heights of wealth, Eliza Batman now found herself the wife of a deformed, indebted cripple. She moved out, and he was ultimately left attended only by his Sydney blacks, the only people who'd stuck with him to the very end. John Batman died at his home in the settlement he founded on the 6th of May, 1839, nearly 4 years after his expedition. He was 38. Batman's story is an important one in the history of Australia and the British Empire. Besides the fact that his life ties in to many key events and scenes of Australian colonial history, his place in the national story should be firmly entrenched by the fact that he is one of the first great Australian-born Britons. He was a currency lad, that is, an Australian-born Briton who made his mark on history. Doing so, he displayed many of the features then perceived as typical of the currency lad: energy, physical prowess, and obedience to law, none of which were features that contemporary prejudice expected to find in those born in a penal colony. British Australia's first generation outdid itself, and contemporaries were rightly impressed. Batman became more than just an exemplar of his generation. His actions directly led to the founding of Melbourne, and 20 years after his death, the Port Phillip district separated from New South Wales and became its own colony, the now state of Victoria. By the end of the 19th century, the city that Batman made possible became known as Marvellous Melbourne, surpassing Sydney as Australia's largest and wealthiest city, and even going on to be the country's first capital. One might say that someone would have got to Port Phillip eventually anyway. If Cortez had not conquered Mexico, someone else would have done so. Fine, those who act reap the glory. In Australian history, the conquest of a vast territory can rarely be attributable to one figure. While private adventurism was a common feature of imperialism in both the Americas and Africa, Batman's story stands out in British Empire history in the Pacific. Exploration and settlerization in this region was nearly always a government project. Batman and his allies, the Port Phillip Association, provided a rare Australian example of private enterprise colonialism. His contemporaries called him the Tasmanian Pen. They could just as well have called him the Vandemonian Conquistador or the Australian Conqueror.